Hello everybody, welcome to Haiku Talk. I'm your host, Ben Ga, your friendly neighborhood haiku poet. And today we're going to take a look at a piece from the latest issue of Modern Haiku, which is hitting mailboxes now. That would be volume 53.2, the summer 2022 issue. And this is a piece from Jon-Michael Frank. And we'll use the first line as the title, which is "The Moon Borrowing Its Light." So, sit back, grab yourself a tasty beverage, and let's haiku. Hello everybody, welcome back. We've got a nice addition to the Haiku Talk catalog today, because we're going to look at this poem by Jon-Michael Frank from Modern Haiku that is 20 syllables long. That's right, 20 syllables long. Most of the pieces that we've seen in all the few episodes leading up to this have been less than 17 syllables in length. But this time we're looking at one that goes just a few syllables more, and it's one of a small number of haiku in the latest issue of Modern Haiku that break the 17-syllable barrier, so to speak. And it does so just fine, without any complaints from me, for sure. It's a wonderful piece. It follows the fragment and phrase structure, and we'll break it down line by line and how it works. But I wanted to bring this to your attention because, by and large, haiku is a small, short form of poetry. And as I said, this is, most people are brought up with the, being taught haiku in school, at least in the United States, and I know other parts of the world as well. And what you're taught in school is that it's a 17-syllable poem that's structured in 3 lines that goes 5 syllables on the first line, 7 syllables on the second line, and 5 syllables again on the third line. And contemporary haiku in the English language, as well as other languages outside of Japan, has really kind of moved away from that. And in the English language, that's really started to move away back in the 1950s and 60s with the Beat generation, starting to dabble in this form. And the real reason for that is, we wanted this to be in contemporary language that you're speaking in. And there are some linguistic incompatibilities between Japanese and English and other languages, which is why syllable counting, a strict rule by syllable counting kind of gets sidestepped. And instead, we focused on everything else that makes a haiku. And if you've been watching this channel, hopefully you picked up several of those things by now. It is a short form poem. It does take place in the present tense. It is a juxtaposition of images. It uses simple, succinct, and suggestive language to pull the reader into the moment and allow the reader to experience that moment as if it were their own. And this poem does all of these things. It just does that in 20 syllables instead of 17 or less. So oftentimes I get really excited about haiku that have one word on a line, or they might be only 5 words long. Yep, sometimes you just need a few more syllables to get the poem to work, and that is the case here. So let's take a look at the poem, shall we? The poem goes like this. The moon borrowing its light. I, too, am the way I am because of something else. The moon borrowing its light. I, too, am the way I am because of something else. It's a really nice poem, and it's a poem about reflection, both literal and non-literal. And let's break this down line by line. So we have the first line. First of all, it follows the fragment and phrase format. So the first line is the fragment, the moon borrowing its light. And the phrase is, I too am the way I am because of something else. So that's the fragment and phrase, and that's putting those two things together, juxtapositioning those two things together is what makes this moment come alive. And I said this is a moment about reflection, and we see this come up again and again and again in the poem as you get from the beginning of the moment to the end of the moment. And so let's look at this line by line and see how that plays into what's happening here. So that first line is the moon borrowing its light. The moon borrowing its light. It's a really nice line. And as I encountered this for the first time, I did notice right away that it is a longer line than what you see a lot of times. And it is, initially, by just glancing at it, you might think, well, that's a little wordy. But in its case, it's really not. The moon borrowing its light. So a lot of times when you encounter a moon poem, you're talking about specifically the moon, and the moon as you see it. And as you see it, you see that glowing orb in the sky in whatever form it's taking it at its specific point in its span, in its cycle. And you don't think much about that because you just see the glowing orb, and the poem is about that. But in this case, it's not about the glowing orb itself. It's about the light and where the light comes. In this case, the moon borrowing its light. So it's about the reflection. It's about the moon isn't visible by itself. It's about we wouldn't see it, more than likely, without the sun. The moon is, as we know it, as we romanticize it, as we pine on it, is only there because it is reflecting the light of the sun. So in this first line, we have a very nice moment, a very nice image about we first see the moon, and then we're taught to reflect on the moon, not just about what we're seeing, but how we're seeing it, why we're seeing it, because it has borrowed light. Very nice line. Then we go down to line number 2, which goes into I, too, am the way I am. I, too, am the way I am. It's really nice. And I really like the technique where you use I, too, am. It's a technique that dates back to Issa. Issa used that a lot. It's the third great Japanese haiku master. And I use that a lot myself. I really enjoy this sort of I, too sort of thing. It's the setting up the I, and then there's a pause, and then you go on about that. And it also sets up, we know there's going to be some sort of comparison or joining between whatever's coming in lines 2 and 3 to what we experienced in line 1. Because it's saying we have line 1, and then we're saying I, too, am going to be like this. And although we don't know exactly what at this point in line 2, how we're making that or how the connection's being made, it sets that up with that little phrasing there. And again, that's something, if you read a lot of haiku in Senryu, you're going to see that show up again and again. And it's one of the ways that's a nice way that ties this genre together. And I think of it as like how I always think about writing as a big conversation of letters, a big conversation that humanity has with itself. And sometimes when you reuse these same themes, these same little tricks, these same little phrasings, it's a way to kind of plug into the past and plug into that there's some sort of continuity there, where Issa uses it, I've used it, Jon-Michael Frank is using it, and others use it as well. And I know in other forms of poetry, we often distance ourselves from reusing lines or reusing snippets, even though it happens all the time. In haiku, there's a bit of, not really a celebration, but as readers of this and writers of this, especially if you really dig into it and are exposed to a lot of it, it's something that just makes you smile when you come across it. And it made me smile when I hit that second line right away. I'm like, oh, I know I'm going to like this poem. It's using this technique that I already enjoy. And so that second line doesn't really give us the full any sort of full information, except for it sets up the fact that I know that by the time I get to the end of line 3, I'm going to know what the juxtaposition really means between the fragment here and the phrase. And so we go to line 3, and line 3 is because of something else. Because of something else. Really nice. And that completes the phrase. I too am the way I am because of something else. And man, I tell you what, this is just it's a poem about reflection. About the lights, the sun's light reflecting off the moon, and then a personal reflection on how we are also become who we are based on the light we receive from others. And you can go in so many directions with that, and it can really break down in a lot of different ways. You can get really spiritual about that. You can use sociology about, with that. You can get into all sorts of different ways of how society teach you, nature, nurture, genetics and reincarnation. I mean, you can go in so many different ways with this piece, depending on how you want to reflect on it. That it's, it makes me want to come back to the poem again and again and reflect in the many ways that I can think about how I am who I am because of something else. And the poem, in true haiku fashion, doesn't tell us what that something else is, and that is the way that this allows us to enter in this space and allows us to make this moment ourselves. This poem also uses the letter/word I in the poem. And I know some people get tripped up on this by saying, well, if you're using I in the poem, how can the reader enter into it? I mean, isn't the poet speaking that isn't the I the poet? And I would argue that when the poem's constructed properly, as this one is, as I, Ben, read this poem, the I becomes me. And as if you read the poem out loud and you read that I, you can't help but connect personally to it as if you are experiencing it, you are saying it yourself. And for me, this works, and this works really well. I mean, I use that in my own work. I like seeing it in other work, but it is something that you have to use correctly. It isn't something that you can just put in there willy-nilly or can get away with it. But that's true of haiku and senryu in general. Because they're so short and so compact, you really have to make sure everything comes together just right and is working the way it's supposed to work. If you have one word out of place, if you have one tense out of place, if you have something out of whack there, then you're taken out of the poem, you're taken out of the moment, and you're looking at the construction like, why? Huh? I don't get it. But when things fall together just right, you can't help but be pulled into the moment and pulled into what seems to be simple language, a simple thing on a page. The poems look like they couldn't be anything other than they are. And there's real beauty in that simplicity, because this also echoes into the idea of the moments that are being captured. They're simple things, but yet speak volumes. And so this one works. And it might be the first time you've experienced a 20-syllable haiku. It might be the only time you experience a 20-syllable haiku, depending on how much you read. But if you are reading journals and if you're picking up contemporary literature, and you likely will run across it once or twice or more than that again. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. And if done properly, like this one, it's great. So that concludes this episode. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a nice time sharing a bit of our days together. I always look forward to doing these when I do them, and imagining people sitting out there watching them, sitting on their couches at their computers, wherever you're watching it, however you're watching it. It's nice to chat with you and spend a little bit of moment of our days together. This poem again is by Jon-Michael Frank. It comes to us from the latest issue of Modern Haiku. You can check out their website right up there. It's a great journal, the oldest English language journal in the world, and always high quality work. It's, fantastic. Each issue, it's a treasure. So do check them out. And again, thank you for tuning in. Like this episode if you like it. Subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying these episodes. I want to see it show up in your recommended list. And it also does help this show up in algorithms if people are searching for things, or you like this, you might also like this type scenarios. And ring the bell if you do subscribe to get notified when new episodes do arise. With that, I leave you. Cheers. Hope everything is well in your world.